Alright, I want you to picture this for a second. It's 2:11 a.m. The wind sounds like it's trying to rip the roof off my house, and the temperature outside is dropping so fast it feels personal. The kind of cold where your nostrils sting when you breathe, and your car door sounds like it's going to snap clean off the hinges. And in the middle of all that chaos, I'm standing alone in a locked utility shed behind my cabin with my hand on one switch. One single switch that decides whether an entire neighborhood stays warm tonight or learns a lesson the hard way. My name's Cole Mercer. I'm a retired electrical systems tech, and I moved up into the hills outside Iron Ridge, Montana because I wanted peace. Quiet. Space. No drama. No people telling me what color my mailbox should be. I wanted to disappear into the snowline and live out my years like a ghost with a coffee mug and a wood stove. But then the HOA showed up. And they didn't just show up with rude emails or lawn rules. They showed up with fake maps, forged paperwork, and a brand new definition of reality where my land magically became community infrastructure. And the wild part? For weeks, while I was being treated like the problem, they were quietly siphoning heat and power through equipment I owned, like parasites in a suit. So when the first real blizzard rolled in, and their shiny little development started leaning on my private line like a crutch, I did what they forced me to do. I pulled the switch, and suddenly, the people who'd been so confident in meetings and emails started panicking in the dark. Now, before you jump down my throat, let me rewind, because I didn't wake up one day and decide to play villain in a snowstorm. This started months earlier, back when autumn still had color. I bought my property almost a decade ago. 22 acres of rough hillside and pine, a cabin that needed work, and something most people didn't understand the value of, an old private utility easement that ran along the ridge. It used to feed an emergency relay station back in the day. The station got decommissioned, but the line and junction hardware never got fully ripped out. So technically, legally, on paper, it was mine. I maintained it the way you maintain something you may never need until the one day you do. Because when you've spent your life working around power systems, you learn one rule fast. The grid doesn't care about your feelings. It only respects what's wired correctly. When I moved in, the land behind me was empty. Just grass, brush, and deer trails. Then a developer bought it and built something they marketed as Summit Pines Village. Luxury cabins and mountain living for people who wanted to pretend they were outdoorsy but still needed fiber internet and heated driveways. They slapped up matching homes, installed decorative street lamps, and formed an HOA within 6 months. I didn't care. I waved sometimes, kept my distance, let them do their thing. Until one morning, I noticed a couple of work trucks parked right up near my east fence line. Not on their land, on mine. I drove down there slow, window cracked, coffee in hand, and I see this guy in a reflective vest holding a clipboard like it's a weapon. I said, "Can I help you?" Real calm, real polite. The guy barely even looked up. He goes, "We're upgrading the utility run for phase 2. We've got access." I said, "Access to what?" He points at a laminated map and goes, "Right here. This strip is community utility property." I took one look at that map, and I felt my stomach drop. Because that strip he was pointing at wasn't some forgotten ditch or unused patch of weeds. It was the exact ridgeline path where my private conduit line ran, perfectly aligned, like somebody traced it on purpose. The map even had a little green highlight, labeled Shared Infrastructure Corridor. I said, "That's not community property." The worker shrugged like I'd told him the sky was blue. "That's what we were given. Talk to the board." And that's when I met Madison Crane, president of Summit Pines HOA, a woman who sounded like she smiled while she talked. I called the number on the notice posted at the gate, and she picked up like she'd been waiting. I explained, very clearly, that their contractors were trespassing, that the map they were using was wrong, and that the property line hadn't changed since I bought the land. There's a pause. Then she hits me with the most insane sentence I've ever heard from an adult. She goes, "Oh no, Mr. Mercer, it has changed. The board voted last month to reclassify that ridge section as shared community access. It's for safety and sustainability." I literally laughed. Just a short sound. Like my brain didn't know what else to do. "You voted," I said, "to take my land." She replied, "It's not taking. It's aligning. The community needs infrastructure continuity." I said, "Lady, this is Montana, not a neighborhood group chat. You can't vote your way onto someone else's deed." Her tone sharpened. "You're being hostile." We're trying to work with you. That's when I knew what she was. Not clueless. Not confused. Calculated. She wasn't asking permission. She was daring me to fight back, hoping I'd fold because fighting is exhausting and people like her make a living off exhaustion. That night, I pulled out my original survey paperwork. I compared it to their plat. It wasn't even a good fake. The boundary line had little distortions, like someone traced it from a photocopy. The county stamp looked slightly off. And the signature name? It wasn't even someone in the assessor's office. It was a community compliance officer. That's not a real thing. That's something a bored tyrant invents when they want authority without accountability. I could have marched down there and started yelling. Could have threatened lawsuits immediately. But I've seen how these people operate. They want you emotional. They want you loud. They want you to look unstable so they can paint you as the problem. So instead, I got quiet. Real quiet. I started documenting everything. I installed trail cameras along the fence line. I pulled power usage logs from my breaker monitoring system. I took photos of their trucks, plates, faces, tools, timestamps. I requested records from the county, every plat Summit Pines had ever submitted. And here's the part that made my skin crawl. I started noticing power load spikes at night, spikes I wasn't causing. At first, I thought maybe my equipment was failing, but the pattern was too clean, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I walked out to the ridge junction panel one morning and found fresh scrape marks on the bolts, tiny curls of copper near the latch. Somebody had been inside that box. And when I opened the panel, I saw it. A brand new tap line threaded in, sloppy and cheap, drawing from my conduit feed and running downhill into their development. They weren't just claiming land. They were stealing heat. Because Summit Pines had built their whole neighborhood heating loop around a backup line they didn't own. They were using my conduit to stabilize their load during peak freeze hours, which meant if that line failed, they'd freeze and they'd blame me. Their comfort was built on my property rights being ignored. So I called an attorney I trusted, Lana Ruiz, a property and utility specialist out of Helena. I sent her everything. Maps, photos, logs, emails. And she goes, "Cole, if they filed forged plats, this could get criminal. But we need more. We need proof of intent, not just trespass." So I kept collecting. I got a private surveyor out there, a guy named Wes Hartman. Old school, no nonsense. The kind of man who could measure a boundary line by the way the wind hits a fence post. Wes flew a drone, mapped the topography, and overlaid the real parcel lines against their fake documents. It matched my paperwork perfectly. Their plat was fiction. Weaponized fiction. Meanwhile, Summit Pines started escalating. First it was letters. Notice of exterior noncompliance. Then it was fines. $200 for unapproved lighting. $300 for visual disruption. They even complained that my shed was the wrong shade of brown. Like the forest cares. Like the elk were going to file a grievance. And every single time, the letters had the same tone, friendly threat. "We'd love to resolve this peacefully, but you're leaving us no choice." Then one afternoon, Madison shows up at my door in person. Not alone. She brought some poor utility contractor with her, like a human shield. She stands there on my porch in a spotless puffer jacket with glossy lipstick and says, "Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer. We're here to discuss the alignment corridor." I said, "You mean my land?" She smiled like I was being silly. "Our community legal team determined the ridge qualifies as a shared infrastructure zone due to its proximity to Phase 2. I stared at her and said, "Your legal team is a fantasy. This isn't a Disney HOA kingdom." The contractor shifted, uncomfortable. Madison didn't blink. "If you refuse cooperation, we may have to proceed with enforcement measures." I stepped closer, lowered my voice. "If you step past my fence again, I'll proceed with criminal charges." Her smile finally twitched. Just a little. Like she wasn't used to someone saying no without fear. After she left, I walked up to the ridge again. And this time, I found something worse. A trench. Not deep, not finished, but started. Like they were preparing to bury a proper connection. On my side of the line. Under the snow. They probably figured nobody would notice. But I noticed. I always notice. I filmed it. Took photos. Called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and had it logged. I didn't want drama. I wanted documentation. Paper trails are power when you're dealing with people who live off paperwork. And then the weather forecast hit. A cold front moving in fast. The kind that shuts roads down and turns your eyelashes into ice. The forecast showed wind chills hitting -25. Maybe worse. I stared at that report and felt something heavy settle into my chest, because now I knew what was coming. They weren't just stealing convenience. They were stealing survival. Because in that kind of cold, heat isn't comfort. It's life. And they built their entire Phase 2 heating system like a leech line off my conduit. They were gambling that I'd never cut it. They were betting on my decency, betting I'd be too afraid of being the bad guy. Then the storm arrived early. Snow started soft, almost pretty, then turned violent. Wind screamed through the trees. The power lines across the valley started icing over. And around 2 a.m., my monitors showed their draw surging. Full load. They cranked everything. Radiant floors, heat pumps, deicers. Like the whole neighborhood leaned on my line and said, "Save us." Without asking, without paying, without admitting what they'd done. So I walked out to my utility shed. Gloves on, boots crunching, wind slamming snow into my face like sand. I unlocked the panel, stared at that red breaker lever, and I felt something ugly rise up. Not rage exactly. More like the bitter kind of clarity you get when you realize someone thinks you're too small to matter. I thought about the fake maps, the threats, the fines, the trench on my land, the way Madison smirked like the world belonged to her because she chaired a meeting once. And I thought, fine, if they want to learn what private property means, they can learn it the hard way. I pulled the switch. Down the ridge, the lights flickered, then went out, one by one, like candles snuffed in a storm. I stood there in the darkness, listening as the wind swallowed everything. And then, faint at first, the chaos began, distant barking, doors opening, people yelling. I could imagine the HOA group chat exploding, phones lighting up while their houses got colder by the minute. About an hour later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message came through shaky, panicked. It was Madison, but her voice was different. Not polished, not confident. "Mr. Mercer, there appears to be a serious outage affecting Summit Pines. We have families, children. We need immediate restoration. Please call me back." I replayed it twice, saved it. Proof. A little after sunrise, someone knocked on my door so hard it rattled the frame. I opened it to a man I'd seen before, one of the residents, mid-30s, red-faced, shaking. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. "My daughter's sick," he said. "Our heat died. The roads are blocked. Please, they told us you had access." And right then, standing there with snow blowing past his shoulders, I realized something important. Most of these homeowners didn't know. They didn't forge anything. They didn't dig the trench. They just bought a house and trusted the wrong people. So here's what I did. And this is the part some folks will still argue about. I didn't flip the main power back on. Not fully. I restored a limited emergency feed, just enough to keep pipes from bursting, just enough to keep temps from dropping into dangerous territory, but not enough for comfort. Not enough to pretend everything was fine. Because comfort was what got stolen. Safety was what I still had control over. When Madison showed up later, she looked like she'd aged 5 years overnight. Mascara smudged. Hands shaking. She walked up to my fence line and said, "Cole, please. We'll negotiate. We'll amend the maps." We didn't realize the conduit was vital. I stared at her and said, "You didn't realize because you didn't care. You didn't ask. You just took." She swallowed hard. "We were told it wasn't used." I said, "You mean you told yourself whatever made theft feel righteous?" She didn't have an answer for that. Within days, Lana filed for an emergency injunction. The county reviewed my evidence package, logs, videos, survey overlays, emails. Summit Pines tried to play innocent, tried to call it a misunderstanding. But intent is hard to deny when you have a forged plat and a trench on private land. The judge issued the order fast. No more work on my parcel, no more claims, no more taps. An audit followed. And oh man, once the money got looked at, the whole thing started collapsing like wet cardboard. Turns out, the HOA had been charging green infrastructure fees to residents for months. Tens of thousands. Meanwhile, their so-called utility improvements were literally a stolen power draw routed through my equipment. And the LLC handling those fees? Owned by Madison's brother. Of course it was. It always is. By the time spring rolled around, Summit Pines HOA didn't just lose the case. It imploded. Board members quit. Contractors walked. The developer distanced themselves like they'd never heard of the place. The county restored my boundary markers, permanent pins with QR-tagged records. Official. Locked. The ridge was mine again, legally and physically. And the funniest part? A month after all this, I get a knock on my door. It's a couple from the neighborhood holding a basket of muffins and a bundle of firewood. They looked embarrassed. The woman said, "We didn't know. We're sorry." The man nodded and added, "We're trying to rebuild without the board, like actual neighbors." And for a second, standing there with cold wind still rolling off the ridge, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, just relief. Like the universe finally corrected itself. But here's the ending that's going to make people mad. Because even after I won, even after the court proved I was right, even after the HOA collapsed, I still get asked the same question. Did you go too far cutting power during a freeze? And my answer is always the same. I didn't cut power to them. I cut access to what was mine. There's a difference. One is cruelty. The other is consequence. And if that blizzard taught anyone anything, it's that you can't build your comfort on someone else's boundaries and expect the weather to care. So now I want to ask you, straight up, what would you have done if an HOA tried to steal your land, forged documents, tapped into your utilities, and treated you like the villain for defending yourself? Do you pull the switch? Do you hold the line? Or do you let them keep taking because you're afraid of being judged for standing up? Drop your take in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between mercy and enabling. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA power trip, tell your story too. I promise you're not alone. If you want more real-world stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and let me know what kind of neighbor nightmares you want next. Because trust me, people will try you, and sometimes the only way to teach them is to remind them. The switch still exists.